So here with us today, we have Nicola Salmon. Nicola is a fat positive and feminist fertility coach and the author of Fat and Fertile. She advocates for change in how fat women are treated on their fertility journey, and she supports fat women who are struggling to get pregnant to find peace in their body, find their own version of health, and finally escape the yo-yo dieting cycle. And hopefully today we'll be dispelling some of those popular beliefs about diet culture, BMI, fertile potential, whilst exploring fat positive ways to ensure people feel confident on the next steps of their fertility journey, and most importantly, confident in their bodies. So welcome, Nicola.
Thank you very much.
One thing I kind of wanted to just touch on super briefly, but within that introduction, the word fat comes up quite significantly. And I know that in all the teachings that you've done, you promote this word as something that you embrace, whereas I think historically we've shied away from that. Can you just talk a little bit about why you've chosen to do that and how other women can embrace this word and sit comfortably with it?
Firstly, I want to say that it's not been a quick journey. Like for me as well, when I was growing up, fat was used as a weapon against me. It was something that wasn't desirable. It was something that you didn't want to be associated with. If anybody called you that, it felt like, you took on so much shame and judgment because of that. And as part of my journey into the work that I do now, I embrace the word fat, because when you break it down to kind of looking at it from a very literal perspective, it doesn't really mean anything. It doesn't mean that you're greedy or that you're lazy or that you don't have any motivation or that you're a horrible person in any way. It literally just describes the way that your body looks, the shape of your body, the cells that you have on your body. And it is actually really quite a neutral describer. Whereas when we look at a lot of other words that we historically used to describe folks in bigger bodies, such as obese or overweight, these can be, when you kind of break them down into looking at these words, they actually are quite harmful. So the word overweight, for example, you're instantly putting a quote unquote normal weight here and then saying people are over that normal weight, so making them abnormal somehow. And the term obese is a really medicalized word that we use to promote the idea that folks who are in bigger bodies are diseased or ill in some way. And body diversity has existed for as long as humans have existed. People have been all shapes and sizes of bodies over centuries and centuries. And there's nothing wrong with being fat. There's nothing wrong with being in a bigger body. It doesn't tell me anything about your health, your fertility. It just tells me about your genetics. And there are over 100 different factors that influence weight. So there is no way we could possibly reduce it to such a simple statement like fat is unhealthy or fat is bad. Fat is a really neutral way. And actually, the more that I've embraced that word for myself as a descriptor, the more empowered I have become around this work, because I'm almost taking that power back from me. And I'm like, yeah, I'm fat. Like, what are you going to do? Like, it doesn't have any power with me. And it actually feels quite empowering to use that word in a positive way and to identify with it.
Mm-hmm. Well, I think it's amazing. I think it's really great what you're doing, and hopefully other women will, again, be inspired by that too. Because I know that historically when I've recommended your book or recommended your Instagram, there's an immediate pullback on it. Like, oh, that feels really uncomfortable. And then they'll take quite a while to kind of start engaging with you because of that kind of pushback. And you mentioned history, and it's something I'm really, really interested in from a feminist perspective, where those roots of body dysmorphia, I guess, have come from. And it's not just as simple as being fat is bad for your health. There's historical roots to this as well.
Yeah, so this isn't my specialist subject at all. There are lots of more intelligent people who know more about this, but there are so many different roots to this work. So like if the further we go back, there are racist roots. So the way that folks as white people have like tried to separate themselves from Black people, and the body diversity exists between races. There's a really great book called Fearing the Black Body, I think, by Sabrina Strings, which is a really comprehensive and well-researched book that goes into the racial roots behind that. There's also colonialist roots. So when people went over to America, there was this idea around like indigenous versus kind of European foods and what that meant. And then there's a religious kind of capacity of like being glutinous seen as a sin. Like there's so many different threads. And a lot of these biases that we hold around being in a bigger body come before it was recognized and kind of taken on board by doctors. So this is pre like the health question or this health thing, that we've decided that thinner bodies are better bodies and fatter bodies are less than good. And also, you know, from our modern age, there is so much when we kind of lean into that feminist lens around how capitalism plays into this. So how we use the fact that there is this thin ideal, this way that we perceive beauty to sell things to people, whether that is, you know, like looking after your skin and having clear skin, and this is what you can buy for that, or cellulite, let's make that a problem so we can sell products to support that. Weight loss surgery, obviously diet culture and telling people that they need to be a certain size in order to be happy or healthy or, you know, rich, successful, meet their partner, all of these things, that is what we are sold. And there are a lot of companies making a lot of money from the fact that we feel less than in our bodies, and that, you know, goes far beyond weight. That is for so many people, and especially people who have been born female at birth.
Yeah, it's big business, hey?
Huge.
It seems to, and again, this getting into the crux of things a little bit, but it seems to not just play into things like, you know, social media that we're being bombarded with left, right, and center, but also the way that policies are formulated and, what was it? Policies and, well, obviously healthcare and access to healthcare, which is obviously what we're thinking about, which is, it's crazy. On the note of healthcare, one of my biggest issues with patients, again, coming in is that working directly with women, women's health and fertility, they come in and they say, well, I've been told that I can't get pregnant because of I'm 32 rather than the norm of below 30 with my BMI. And obviously, after having done training with you, I very much am, you know, rooted in this understanding of where BMI now comes from. So I wonder if you can just explore that to dispel these myths around BMI for myself again and for other people, just so they've got an understanding of that.
Absolutely. So BMI, when it was invented, was never invented as a marker for individual health. It was actually invented by, I think it was a Belgian astronomer, like hundreds of years ago, to kind of look at population health. So looking at big picture, looking at like countries of populations, thousands of people, and looking at how maybe their weight and their height impacts their health. And it was never ever intended to be like this arbitrary number here, this BMI of 30, for example. It was never meant to be used as a barrier to healthcare, because it is a very simplistic formula. It doesn't take into account so many different factors. And it's a really oversimplification of health. Like we have a lot of studies now that show that actually when you start to look at things beyond weight but are associated with weight, for example, how people in bigger bodies experience healthcare, or like the history of dieting that a lot of fat folks have, all of these factors actually have a much more reliable indicator of somebody's health rather than just the fat cells on their body. And also a lot of the studies that show, okay, well, if somebody loses weight, then their health markers, like their health improves. They're never separating out the weight loss versus the behavior changes that people make. So for example, if somebody's going through a weight loss journey, if they're going into a study, for example, maybe their movement increases, maybe they start to eat different foods, maybe they hydrate more, maybe they sleep more, like all of these different behaviors that we have control over, the results of those behaviors are never separated out from that weight loss. And we have studies that show that when people make these behavior changes, you start to see things like improvement in blood pressure, improvement in blood sugars, like all of these markers that we can actually look at in real time and that we know that relate to health. Those things shift and change and improve regardless of what somebody's weight does, whether that goes up, goes down, or stays the same. So it's things that we can control, those behaviors that can be the really helpful and important things. And having a focus on weight is really not helpful and actually can be really harmful.
Do you see that then with your own patients historically, where they've been denied access to those levels of testing and levels of diagnostics simply because of their weight?
That happens all the time. So many people will go to their GP as their first port of call, and their doctors won't even give them the basic hormone panel. They won't test anything. They won't even test their partner's semen if they're in a heterosexual couple. They will just say, it's your weight, please come back when you are X pounds or kilograms lighter. And that is so unethical. It's not what the NICE guidelines say. So the NICE guidelines are the guidelines that we should be following in healthcare. And they don't recommend, they have like suggested guidelines around BMI, but they don't say, don't treat this person. So it's the doctors that are then making that decision that, well, BMI is bad. Like, we know that you're fat. We think that that's the problem. So therefore, we're not going to support you and treat you until you've lost the weight, which is really harmful to people.
Where does that come from then, that assertion that, they are the authority in this and they're the decision makers? Is it from research? Is it from, bias? Where is that really kind of coming from?
So it's really layered. So all of those things are true. Like, medicine is a very patriarchal system that over hundreds of years has been built on this power dynamic where the doctors are right and the patients have to do exactly what's told. And that is still very much the system that we have in play today. And it's getting better. Like, patient-centered care is becoming a conversation that we're having now, but there still very much exists this hierarchical system where we do what the doctor's told, the doctor knows best. And within those systems of healthcare, we historically have had this foundational belief that fat is bad. And, it goes down to all those roots that we've talked about earlier, but it's infiltrated our research. So all the researchers are doing the research, which is often paid by the pharmaceutical companies who have weight loss drugs to sell, who have weight loss surgery to sell, and diets to sell. So it's really important that we look at who is doing the research. Do they have their own biases that have not been taken into consideration? What assumptions are they already making? If you're looking at any kind of paper that looks at weight, often you'll be able to tell in the first sentence if there are any biases present, because they will often mention the quote unquote obesity epidemic or talk about how we know that fat is bad already. And this is we can see very clearly from the very beginning how biased people are when they're doing that research. And what's happened is that people have built this foundation and then they're building on that foundation, but the foundation is wrong. Therefore, that everything else that is built on is also, going to fall down. So an example that I use often is the research around pregnancy loss and BMI. There is this kind of well-recognized and well-known fact that people with a higher BMI have higher incidences of pregnancy loss. And when I went to look at the research and where this fact came from, actually, it was only about a third of the research that showed a correlation between BMI and pregnancy loss. Another third roughly showed there was no link at all, and about a third showed there was a link, but it wasn't significant, so you couldn't, make any conclusions from that. And what the researchers did with that big pile of information is said, okay, well then this shows that there is a link, which, when you have all the evidence in front of you, it is clearly not. The majority of the evidence does not show that, and there has never been found a link, like what physiologically is going on. So they haven't found that biological mechanism that would cause that. So we don't know that for a fact, but that has been disseminated to doctors who then teach that, who then pass that on, who then, give that message to pregnant people or people who want to get pregnant. So it kind of keeps on being a fact when actually the initial research and evidence didn't support that. So it's really frustrating. And once that kind of goes into that machine, it's really hard to reverse it and really start to pin and kind of understand where it's come from and why that's happened.
Yeah. So I see, again, patients come in, they've had a miscarriage, and then they say, well, it's my fault because I was 31 BMI, not 30. And now all I've got to do to be able to stay pregnant is get below that 30. And it's so it's heartbreaking seeing that. And it's so destructive, because then what they go and do is crash diet, and they starve themselves. And correct me if I'm wrong, but from my understanding, fat people or people in a bigger body, if they crash diet, they still go into starvation mode. So it's still this very tangible, very physiological impact on your body despite the weight. So it's not, you can still go into that where your body retains, because it's gone into a state of stress. And that stress has a huge cascading impact on your hormones and how then your cycle is, and your thyroid, and all the things that our body so needs to be able to regain fertile potential. So actually it has the opposite effect of what you're trying to achieve, but tangibly, theoretically, you're more fertile because you're below BMI 30, which is just mind-blowing, just cracking.
Yeah, it is wild. And there's so many more pieces at play, like people's mental health is then negatively impacted by that. Like they feel unsafe because they're like, well, I'm never going to be able to get pregnant and stay pregnant at this size. So then, their body is in, their nervous system is in that really reactive state all that time. And also there may be something else going on that is completely unrelated to their weight, but it will never be picked up. It will never be treated because the doctor won't do those tests, won't look for anything else because they're assuming it's their weight. So there's so many ways that plays into them not receiving then adequate healthcare and support.
And in particular, I guess, from a fertility perspective, access to IVF, because they're like, categorically no, unless you fall within this parameter, it's a no from us, which is really, really challenging for a lot of women, because often part of, not always, but part of the issues going on from their hormones perspective, be it a metabolic issue or whatever, feeds into the fact that they can't lose weight or can't get below that, and then they end up in a whole world of problems because the main issue has not been addressed, diagnosed, and supported. What do you suggest to women in that situation that are trying to navigate the IVF process in a bigger body?
I just want to acknowledge how hard it is, and you should not be put in this place where you have to decide between growing your family or losing weight and jumping through these kind of hoops in order to get access to healthcare. This should be available to everybody in every size body, and the evidence shows that it's effective, and the evidence shows that it is safe. So I just want to acknowledge that it is not your fault that you're here, and you deserve absolutely that care. Unfortunately, there aren't loads of options, and it is so frustrating. So people can choose to go down that weight loss path, and whilst I don't, I know for myself that weight loss doesn't work, we know there's so much evidence that any form of intentional weight loss is ineffective beyond 2 to 5 years. But I understand why people would go through that in order to meet these arbitrary barriers and boundaries. You can appeal the NHS decision, and whilst I don't know anybody who's been successful through that, and it takes a lot of emotional labor, it's an option, and it's something that I am so happy to support anybody who wants to go through that. I'm happy to share all the evidence that I have that this should be available and achievable for folks. And then the other option is being able to financially afford private treatment, and again, that is a privilege because it is expensive. There aren't loads of clinics in the UK that will support people, and especially as people's BMI gets higher, there are fewer and fewer clinics that will support folks. There's a great clinic in Ireland that doesn't have a BMI limit, and there are some in Europe, for example, Greece, that don't have BMI limits. So there are options, but obviously that is something which comes at a financial cost. For going abroad, you need to be in a position where you're able to take time off work or work remotely. It is a massive disruption in your life, and whilst like everybody would move heaven and earth in order to do it, it is a real consideration that people have to, do these things, go that extra mile in order to access the care that they should be able to receive from their local hospital.
Mm-hmm.
So yeah, I want to say that there are options available, but it sucks right now.
Yeah. People like you, though, are changing the discourse in a way.
I hope so.
Yeah, definitely. Tell me a little bit about how you got here then, how you got to become supporting women in the way that you are. I'm so passionate, obviously, about what you're doing.
So I was diagnosed with polycystic ovarian syndrome when I was 16. So for all that time, I believed that I wouldn't be able to get pregnant. That's what the doctor said at that time. They're like, nope, you won't be able to get pregnant. Go and lose weight, go on the oral contraceptive pill. And since I've shared that, a lot of people have shared that they have also received a similar story when they've been diagnosed with PCOS, that they won't be able to get pregnant. So I spent all my teens, 20s believing that about myself. And that had so many, far-reaching impact on my self-esteem, my self-confidence, the decisions I made in my life. But ultimately, it wasn't difficult for me to get pregnant. I got pregnant really easily with both my boys. Around that time, I was training as an acupuncturist. So that's kind of how I got into fertility. I specialized in fertility acupuncture because of obviously my interest in hormones. Often these things come up because you've had only your personal experience with it. And then as I did my fertility acupuncture, I trained as a coach as well, because I wanted to provide like additional skills, additional ways to support folks who were going through this. And yeah, when my son was about 6 months old, my first son, I just kind of had this moment of, wow, like I don't really have the time to be thinking about dieting. I don't want to be trying to find a way of making my body smaller. And I also don't want to pass this on to him. Like, I don't want him to talk about his body in the way that I talk about mine. And I don't want him to think about food in the way that I do. So that was kind of my like, oh, yeah, I'm just not going to do this anymore. That was like my escape from diet culture. But the more I learned about it, the more angry I got and the more frustrated I got. And when those kind of two worlds collided almost in my like fertility work and my anti kind of diet work, I realized that I couldn't find anybody else that was talking about how harmful fertility diets are and how obsessed the fertility industry is with people controlling what they eat, restricting foods. And yeah, I just had to start talking about it because I was so, although I didn't struggle to get pregnant in the end, I knew that in a parallel universe somewhere that would be me, where I wouldn't be able to access healthcare, I would not be able to access support in order to grow my family. So I knew that I was in quite a unique position to be able to help folks navigate this and figure out ways of getting support to grow their families, because they absolutely deserve that.
And now you work with offering online coaching in quite a unique way to help support women self-advocate for themselves and break down the mindset, this kind of very self-destructive mindset. Is that right?
Yeah, so I kind of created quite a unique framework in order to support folks, because folks in bigger bodies are in a very unique position within accessing fertility care. And often they don't have access to things that folks in smaller bodies do. Often they'll have very turbulent relationships with their body, with food, and looking at what that could look like in terms of fertility and health. And often we have so many thoughts in our minds around how our bodies have failed us and how if we could only make them smaller and it's all our responsibility and all our fault. So it's about having a multifaceted way of approaching all of those different things in order to make it a very holistic way of supporting people through all of the different challenges that fat folks specifically face when navigating fertility.
It's really interesting. I love the framework, by the way. I think it's beautiful. It's really interesting what you said just then about blame. And I feel like this isn't necessarily unique to fat people. It's unique, or it's widely encompassing of women, particularly in fertility, because of these patriarchal issues within healthcare that have kind of presented to us and continue to restrict us. What I find is that women are they place blame on themselves so much around, well, it's my body that can't get pregnant, and it's nothing to do with the man.
Never.
Is right. So how everything seems to fall on our shoulders, and that message is reiterated from a medical professional perspective, because they're the ones poking and prodding us. We're the ones that are subject to medical procedures, medical tests, medication, and yet the man does sweet FA, and
they just jizz in a cup.
Yeah, exactly.
Not hard.
Yeah. But also so much of your message, and I guess so much of your support, goes well beyond just women, because that also feeds into men and supporting themselves and their health in this fertility process. Yeah, so I find it really interesting helping people to break down that culture of blame that we've encompassed as a gender, and extending the responsibility out to the whole facet, two halves of a whole. I think it's really interesting, because that fat bodies also comes into play with men, when you see men coming into clinic and their hormone parameters are a little bit out and stuff, and how much of an impact again working with them can have on things like sperm parameters.
Absolutely. And I think so much emotional labor is put on women, or women who identify, people in this way and in this space, and they're the ones that have to track their cycle every month. Like, it takes over their whole lives. And I think it's really helpful to share that emotional labor, share that load. I get clients, asking their partners to track them for them, and them doing all the calculations and the monitoring, just so that they understand exactly how much labor this takes, how much time and brain power it takes away from you, and so that it can feel like a shared experience, because that's what it should feel like. You're both in it, you'll both want to grow your family, so therefore you both should be taking on an equal load of that.
Absolutely. Something you touched on about your personal story as well is that about PCOS, and I feel like it's quite a misunderstood diagnosis in many ways, isn't it? Where immediately there's this presumption that PCOS diagnosis is solely a bigger bodied person issue, when it's not that at all. And what I loved about, again, some of your work and some of your training is looking into the research around PCOS and medications and fertility outcomes. So I wonder if you could just share a little bit about that to, again, dispel any myths about meds not working on bigger bodies, or PCOS, again, just being that fat person problem.
Yeah, absolutely. PCOS affects folks in all bodies. Like, we know that for a fact. We have the research that supports that. The problem that fat folks will often get is that people will assume they have PCOS based on their body if they have irregular cycles. And there are plenty of other reasons why you could have irregular cycles. And doctors will also often be quite lazy about that and not do a proper differential diagnosis, figuring out what's going on. Therefore, you could be put on meds that are potentially harmful or completely ineffective because they're not related to what's actually going on. In terms of like support and medications, I have people who've reported from their doctors that they say, oh, well, the medications just don't work for fat people. And that is 100% absolutely not true and not supported by any of the research. Things like Clomid and letrozole, which induce ovulation, can be really helpful for folks in PCOS of all bodies. Sometimes they'll need a bigger dose, and that is a trend that we see. It's not the same for everybody. And I encourage with all medicine that it should be personalized. People should be given the dose that is appropriate for their body, depending on so many different variables. But we need to be tracking people and monitoring people and figuring out what's going to work for them. So you may need a higher dose, you may not, but they do work, and they should be more freely and easily available to folks in bigger bodies, because sometimes that's just the bit that they need, that bit of medication, which isn't expensive, like it can be pennies, but it can be really helpful in supporting them with what they need with their PCOS, which is just about cycle regulation. So it's a really frustrating situation for fat folks to be in from both angles, in terms of being denied medicine, but also often being misdiagnosed just because of the size of their body.
Yeah, it's so interesting. And again, when the research is out there, it's just mind-blowing that it's not a message that is reflected to us when we go see these medical professionals, unfortunately. So if you, as you do what you do, is there one or a couple of tangible piece of advice you'd offer to someone in a bigger body that is trying to conceive and again has been passed from pill to post? Is there one key thing that you think is the thing to help get them through this kind of very tricky period of time?
The one thing that I always emphasize every single time is that I want them to know that they are worthy of receiving this care and support. You don't need to perform weight loss. You don't need to jump through these hoops in order to be worthy of this. I know that you want this bad enough. You don't have to show that in any way. You don't have to perform health. You don't have to do this. You are totally worthy of receiving all the care and support that you need in order to grow your family. And that is just if people knew that and knew that in their core and could believe that, then I know that they'd have the equipment and the tools to be able to push forward and ask for that care when sometimes it's not available and sometimes it's more difficult to get.
And how would people go about working with you then? How would that look?
So there's lots of different ways that I support folks. I have the book, and if you are in a financially difficult position, you can get it from the library. I have workshops that are available at a lower cost, and I also have group programs and one-to-one work that people can do who need more support or want some more one-to-one support. So I try to make my work as accessible as possible. I share loads on my social media around the research so people can use that themselves to advocate if they're going to the doctors. I don't want to gatekeep any of this work, but saying that if you want that hand holding, if you want someone on your side in your corner, then I do have kind of one-to-one options available for people who want that.
Mm-hmm. And this would be, again, support in many ways, supporting them in self-advocating with their doctor, going in with some tangible bit of research or information to say, actually, I want to challenge this. I want to challenge this discourse, and I want to be able to move forward with treatment because here's the fact, here's the statistics.
Absolutely. It's finding clinics. It's talking through that research, creating plans around how to do that safely. It's around mindset work, around helping you believe that you're capable of getting pregnant. It's around moving away from weight loss goals and looking at what your health could look like without those and how to support your health in ways that don't feel restricted or punishing. Yeah, so many different facets that can come into it, but it is really just about meeting people where they're at and giving them a safe space to be able to share what's going on for them.
And obviously the work that you're doing is incredible. But how far along this journey do you think we are, and what else needs to change in order for us to break down these misbeliefs?
We are just one tiny step on a really long road, unfortunately. We need to break down a lot of the systems that we have in place. That's, so many of our healthcare systems and our medical systems are based on this belief that fat is bad. And we need to smash that all down and start again in order to be able to give people equitable care. And there are some incredible people doing that, both in the general medical world and the fertility world. But we need momentum. We need that big shift to happen. And so as many people who can to get on board with this and share this message and influence people in their lives, the quicker that we can do this.
Fantastic. Thank you so much, Nicola. I really appreciate everything that you've been saying. Again, having the opportunity to speak with you in this way and be able to share your message to a wider audience, hopefully, again, is one of the small steps on that ladder to be able to push forward with change. So I really appreciate you taking the time to share this, because as I said, I feel like sometimes I'm banging my head against a brick wall with patients in relaying your message. So it's so nice to be able to hear it from you personally, so that they can better understand it and hopefully engage with it and hopefully feel empowered by it ultimately, that their body is beautiful and they should feel confident in their fertile potential as well.